I recently learned about the Japanese invasion of China and saw the real footages of Nanjing genocide, which were unbelievably horrifying, probably worse than the Holocaust. Excuse me. My questions are: have those tragedies influenced the Chinese in making them aggressive as they are today? And why have the Japanese still not apologized for it? Why is Japanese barbarism not talked about, even though it is an important part of Second World War history? Okay, so I came across these images of the Nanjing atrocity a long time ago. It kind of, when I first saw that, it kind of ruined my day. I think I did not eat food all day. That's how bad it was. So the Japanese behaved in an unbelievably savage and brutal and barbaric way. There's no two ways about it. They did. They 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 cast aside all notions of being human. They were worse than animals, the Japanese, who rampaged across Asia. It was not only in China that they did such atrocities. I mean, look at what they did in Korea to women, especially, and what they did to prisoners of war in other places. There is this unbelievable true story of the Japanese executing American prisoners of war and cannibalizing them, eating them alive. Not alive, but eating them, and so on. And there were atrocities against Indian prisoners of war as well. So the Japanese behaved in an unbelievably horrific, barbaric, brutal, bestial manner in the Second World War. No doubt about it. Um, why is this? Why is it not talked about? People do talk about it, especially the Chinese. The Chinese make it a point of highlighting and publicizing what the Japanese did during the Second World War. The South Koreans also do the same, right? So I would not. Well, was what the Japanese did worse than the Holocaust? I don't think so. I don't think so. The Holocaust had a death toll of how many people? 6 million, was it? I think it's 6 million Jews and Indian origin Romani people. I may be off by a few percent here and there, but something like that. So I think if you look at the magnitude of the death toll, I think the Holocaust is worse. But if you look at the imagery that comes out of the Japanese depredations in Asia, it's kind of revolting. It makes you want to throw up. So, so the question is, so let's address the question of why did the Japanese do such things? I mean, the Japanese are traditionally a Buddhist nation, very, very strongly Buddhist and not Confucian. Sorry, it's a mixture. It's a syncretic mixture of Buddhism and Shinto, right? And the Buddhism, what we call Buddhism, is essentially the entirety of Indian culture. They worship Ganesh, Saraswati, all Hindu gods and goddesses with Japanese names, and they call it Buddhism, and the Western world calls it Buddhism. It's actually just Indian culture. Like I said many, many times, there is no real difference, significant difference between Buddhism and Hinduism. It's all part of the dharmic umbrella. So Japan, for at least 1500 years, has been a dharmic nation. So these are the cultural and civilizational values that are part of Japanese culture. You cannot say that it's a foreign religion that has come into Japan. It's been part of their culture for 1500 plus years. They have accepted it willingly. Nobody is imposed on them. So it's part of Japan. That's what it is. So how did these dharmic people end up committing such horrific, stomach churning atrocities? Right. It's because of the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Emperor in the 19th century decided that he was going to westernize Japan. He decided that Japan was too Asiatic, too primitive, too backward, and he was enamored with the Western ways, industrialization, progress, and so on. So he decided to cast aside Buddhism, to cast aside dharmic values and industrialize and westernize the nation. So he started this reform program called the Meiji Restoration. He did his best to stamp out Buddhism from Japan. Did not work. But the legacy of that is that today the Japanese see Buddhism as a foreign religion that is part of Japan today. So they don't see it as an indigenous religion or indigenous way of life. They see it as something that has come from outside. But it's still very much part of Japanese culture, whatever of it is still practiced today. Lots of Japanese are atheists today. It's a consequence of the 70 plus years of foreign occupation of Japan. Anyhow, that's a different story. So the Meiji Emperor embarked upon this program of westernization, of throwing out dharmic values. He created a westernized industrial force, a westernized army, and that was continued on with it by his son, grandson, and so on. So by the time of the Second World War, the Japanese are they destroyed the samurai system, which was, the samurais were devout Buddhists. They had this code of ethics called Bushido, and that was, they would die rather than break that code of ethics and code of behavior, Bushido. So the modern post Meiji restoration Japanese army had no such qualms. They, and because they abandoned dharmic values, that's why they acted like the worst of savage beasts. That's the reason why all of these horrific atrocities happened all across Asia, whether it's in Korea, whether it's in China, or wherever else. So it is certainly talked about. The Chinese will never give up an opportunity to speak about what the Japanese did, and neither will the Koreans. Now, have the Japanese not apologized? They have apologized multiple times. How many times do you want today's Japanese citizens to apologize for what their ancestors did? Right? And I think the Japanese have been punished enough for what they did in the Second World War. I mean, they have been nuked twice. They were nuked twice. They are still suffering from the consequences of the radiation that was emitted by those atomic bombs. And they are still under American occupation. I think they have been punished more than enough. And they are laboring under a foreign constitution, an American written constitution. So that's where it is. I think it is too. I mean, how many times do you want them to apologize? And then there is this desire to resist this, right? There are certain nationalistic politicians who want to be unapologetic because they are sick and tired of being made to apologize and of laboring under this back-breaking foreign occupation of Japan. So there are certain currents in Japanese politics that are like they want to glorify the Japanese imperial era of the Second World War and so on. So there are, obviously, in a nation you will have all kinds of different schools of thought and so on and so forth. So that is highlighted from time to time, and that's used to portray Japan as a nation that is still unapologetic about what it has done, which is not quite the case.